we're going to draw a lot of graphs. And the first and most important thing about drawing graphs is to get the labels right. So let's think about the market for masks. In late March, early April of 2020. What would you begin by showing? What's one thing that you know about the market for masks late March, early April?
Demand was high.
Sorry?
Demand was high.
Demand increased. Okay, let's show right before that, right though? Okay, so we'll say, what's the normal demand curve like for masks? Is it elastic, inelastic? I would say normally it's relatively elastic, just a regular normal demand curve, right? A lot of people would buy masks if they were going to do woodworking jobs, or if they knew they were going to be around people who had sensitivities, but yeah, it's probably pretty price sensitive. What about the supply for masks? How would we expect the market for the market supply for masks to look like right before COVID hits? Maybe also sort of elastic, but maybe like that. As soon as COVID hits, a couple of things happen, don't they? Right, the demand curve for masks changes, doesn't it? How would we describe that change?
Increase.
An increase or a shift to the
Right.
right. Thank you. So the demand shifts to the right. Notice what happens. Quantity increases, and so does price. But what do we know about the supply at the same time?
In the short run, it's unchanged.
In the very short run, it's unchanged. Although, yes, in the very short run, it's unchanged. But then, right, there were also a whole bunch of trade barriers put in place that actually decreased the supply. Right? There was limitations about who could buy masks and where. So actually, we saw a decrease in the supply of masks. So then, what can we say about the quantity after all said and done? Not a lot.
There's a shortage.
At the given price, there would be a shortage, assuming prices couldn't fluctuate. Right? Shortages emerge when prices are not permitted to fluctuate, when there's a control. However, in this case, we would say that the price went up again, and we're sort of ambiguous in terms of the total quantity, right? So much so that people were sewing masks. Now, how many grandmas you hear about sewing masks at home? Right? My mom did it. Okay. Actually, there was a place across the street from where I live. There was a garage, a small warehouse, and some dude hired all the kids from Muncie Central to come over and for $10 an hour to make the face shields, right? And I thought that there was a perpetual party going on over there. I'm like, the kids are out of school, they decided just to party all day long because they had the music blaring, you know, and there was always just tons of teenagers over there. But the guy was paying $10 an hour to go and manufacture masks. There's such a great increase in demand. That would be an increase in supply as well, right? Okay. So we can take the principles, make sure we label our axes here. That's going to be important too. We take the principles from our basic supply and demand framework and understanding of markets and how things respond in markets. And we want to try to take this and aggregate it to talk about the whole market. The market for all goods and services. All goods and services. Now, the first thing we have to do is change the label. All goods and services. Now we're going to have to label our axes. And instead of price here, what I'm interested in is not necessarily the price of any good or service in particular. In a marketplace, the prices of goods and services are all each changing up or down based upon changes in preferences and other things, what new stuff is coming out, right? So the individual prices are going up and down all the time. What we're interested in is when prices in general are going up, when prices in general are going down, right? I'm going to do a TikTok of that later. No. So then what I'm interested in is the overall price level. I represent that by using the symbol pi. Pi. That's the general price level, or the rate of inflation is another way that we talk about that. On the x-axis, I usually put y. Y is the quantity of all goods and services. Another way of calling it is GDP. However, I'd like to keep both the y and the x-axis in terms of percentage change for now. Our textbook might not do it that way, but for now, I want to think about it in terms of percentage changes as we do aggregate supply, aggregate demand here. And so what I'm going to talk about here is the percentage change in real GDP. Okay, percentage change in real GDP. What do we mean by that? You guys remember this animal? Does that look familiar to you? The production possibility frontier? Production possibility frontier? Now, the idea behind the production possibility frontier is that this is our maximum sustainable level of production, and it demonstrates the opportunity cost between another unit of X and another unit of Y. The slope of the production possibility frontier at any point would be the relative price of X in terms of Y. Okay, so assume Y is the money for a minute, then it would be the relative price of X in terms of Y. How many Y's do I have to give up in order to get another X? The relative price of X in terms of Y. Or I could just as easily say the relative price of Y in terms of X. How many X's do I have to give up in order to get another Y? That price is the slope of that line, is it not? In other words, the price is the ratio between X and Y. That's a relative price. In the market, especially in micro, right, all we're interested in are relative prices. How many apples for an orange? How many coconuts for a fish? Right? Relative prices. That's a ratio. Is it not? All right, and we use that ratio to make decisions about how to ration the goods and services we have available to us, because you know what kind of people we are? We're rational people, aren't we? Okay. Now here's our production possibility frontier. Does that mean that we can never achieve anything outside of our production possibility frontier? Did I cover any of this last time? No? Okay. What if X is studying for economics and Y is studying for finance? And you got a final next week in both. You could produce outside your sustainable level of production in the short run, couldn't you? Yeah, you could pull an all-nighter. But what's going to happen? After you take the exam, what happens? You take a nap. Don't you? Sure. So then the frontier isn't a hard frontier. It's not a wall that you can't penetrate. Winter is coming. Right? You can't go beyond that. It's not that you can't go beyond that. It's that you can't stay beyond that. Right? This is the sustainable level. As a matter of fact, if you do too much of this and that, what might happen to the curve? If you're constantly going back and forth, what might happen to the curve?
It'll shrink.
Yeah, it might shrink because it's hard on your body to be pulling all-nighters and then taking naps. It's not healthy. So then, in the market for all goods and services, what we're interested in is what is the sustainable level of production, and is it changing over time? We know that real GDP per capita output is increasing. You're better off than your kids, well, than your grandparents were. Sorry. How can you know that you're better off than your grandparents were? What indicators do you have? No. Did your grandparents all go to college? Maybe not. My grandparents didn't go to college. Neither of my parents graduated from college. I'm first gen, right? And I went all the way and kept going. How about the kinds of goods and services you're able to buy? Your grandparents probably had a phone. Nothing like what you got now. What about green beans? How have green beans today changed from the way green beans used to be? You ever go to a Thanksgiving dinner and get served green bean casserole? You know what I'm talking about, green bean casserole? It's a bunch of green beans mixed in with cream of mushroom soup and then some of these crispy fried onions on the top. Is that how your grandma makes it? In a green bean casserole? Why did green bean casserole become such a popular dish for Thanksgiving? Because it made canned green beans taste good. The only kind of green beans you were getting in November in most places in the country were canned green beans. When's the last time you had canned green beans? We typically don't anymore. We can get fresh green beans almost year round. We can get fresh blueberries year round. My wife loves blueberries, right? And in the middle of winter, right, she's asking me to buy blueberries at the grocery store. It's like $5 for, you want fresh blueberries? Okay. I call them fruit candy because that's essentially what they are. It's super high luxury. And we're able to get fresh fruits and vegetables year round. Part of that has to do with container ships. The fact that we're able to ship goods across the ocean so cheaply and efficiently today compared to 40 years ago. So we are experiencing economic growth over time, but that's growing at a somewhat predictable rate. And some people say GDP growth is around 3% a year. This is our long-run aggregate supply curve, and it relates directly to our production possibility frontier, which we expect to be expanding at a rate of about 3% a year. Our maximum sustainable level of production. Now this is interesting. Why? Because it's different from this supply curve. This supply curve is upward sloping, not perfectly inelastic. Right? Perfectly inelastic means straight up and down. That's the technical term for perfectly inelastic, up and down. Right? And it's helpful to know that a perfectly inelastic curve looks like an I. And a perfectly elastic curve looks like an E. And there is something called a unit elastic curve, which actually looks like a U. I don't know why they don't point that out in textbooks, but they don't. So the long-run aggregate supply curve is straight up and down as compared to the supply curve for any particular good or service. Why? Well, because if a particular good becomes more popular, and more people are willing to buy it, sellers will respond by selling more of it. But the long-run aggregate supply curve represents the maximum level of production that's sustainable for everything. So it can't be upward sloping, because there's no substitution of making this for that. It's everything, so it has to be perfectly inelastic. But wait, I thought you said that sometimes we can pull an all-nighter. Sure, the economy can do that too. The economy can extend beyond what is sustainable for the short run. We often see it doing that in the short run, don't we? We often see the economy overexerting. So what happens? The unemployment rate gets below, quote unquote, the natural rate of unemployment. Or a lot more people are working overtime. Or those kinds of things can happen. We talked about last time how that can happen if, for some reason, aggregate demand boosts. Let me start with that one and then that one. There's a boost to aggregate demand, perhaps by having an increase in the quantity of money supplied. The Fed prints a whole bunch more money, or loosens the reserve ratio. Then we might expect to see in the short run, right? In the short run, an increase in overall activity, in overall economic activity. We might see an expansionary period as a consequence of increasing of the quantity supply of money. But what do we know happens in response to that? We did this last time also. Aggregate supply represents an expectation about inflation. So in response to an increase in money supply that was not anticipated, at the old expectation of inflation, output increases. Prices go up a little bit. But then over time, aggregate supply, the short run aggregate supply, right? We adjust our expectation about inflation. As a result, we end up back on our maximum sustainable level of output, but at a much higher price level. We did that last time, right? But wait, Snow, I thought you said that if we pull an all-nighter, we're gonna have to take a nap. Where's the nap? It's not really on there, is it? There is no overshooting such that we end up over here for a little while in this model. I think that's actually a flaw in the model. I haven't seen an aggregate supply, aggregate demand analysis that actually pushes productivity down below the maximum sustainable level in response to an overheated economy. It's as if everybody was working extra hard and then none of them had to take a nap. I think this is a flaw in the model. Not a big one, but something that's interesting to think about anyway. Now for all of this, all of what we've done here, we're assuming several things. In particular, we're assuming that we can know anything about the overall economy. We're assuming that we have facts and data. Chapter 2 of our textbook is about the facts and data and how to measure it. So measuring macro data. What kinds of data do we want to collect? Well, before we get into the different kinds of data, let's talk for just a minute about why the government is the agency that collects most of the data. So in your textbook it says, you go to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and they collect this data, they do it every so often, right? And why is it that the government is the agency that's collecting the data? Or another way to say it is, why does the government want to collect the data? Start with benevolent purposes. What's a good reason for the government to do this?
Allows more effective governance.
Okay, improve governance. In what sense? Well, if the government has to spend money, it might be a good idea for the government to have an idea about how much money it can expect to bring in next year. And so having a good measure of GDP provides you with a good idea of what your tax base is, so as to know what tax rate to set and how much revenues you're going to collect. Presuming, of course, that the government isn't just going to run a deficit. Ha, ha, ha. Even if it runs a deficit, it still has to have some sort of projection about incomes in the future that will be able to pay that off. In other words, whether or not anybody would be willing to buy their debt. So it can improve governance and improve planning for the government. What other reasons might the government, for benevolent reasons, collect this statistical data? Well, it provides a public good. In other words, business people, financiers, might be interested in knowing some facts about the macroeconomy. And so having data about that as indicators is valuable to people within the economy. So having that data available is helpful to everybody. So they're providing a public service by collecting this data. The government does a lot of things that are public services. Some of them only the government could do. Some of them could be done privately. But there is a public good element to this. Why might the government collect the data for less than benevolent purposes? Well, they might want to manipulate policies. They might want to change some policies. For example, there's been some research that shows that before elections, the Fed has frequently increased the rate of inflation. Why would the Fed increase the rate of inflation shortly before an election?
Makes the current sitting president look better.
Makes the current incumbent politicians look better. Why? Well, because you get a short-term boost in aggregate output. The unemployment rate falls. People have money in their pockets. The economy seems to be doing good. And when the economy seems to be doing good, people are less likely, at the margin, to vote the current incumbents out. So it helps those who are in power to stay in power. Are you with me? Right? People who are in power typically have three objectives. One, to maintain the power that they have. Two, to use it on somebody. And three, to get more power. That's for free. So then, the government might have some exogenous goals. What do I mean by exogenous goals? That is, those who are in the position of making decisions have goals exclusive unto themselves that are different from the goals that would be generated endogenously by all of the people coming to agreement together. They might be doing it for themselves instead of for all of us. Should we presume benevolence on the part of decision makers? I would prefer not to. Matter of fact, I would prefer that you do not presume benevolence about me. Every man a knave. Presume that I'm a knave. And I'll presume that you're a knave. Expect that from each other, and then impose constraints appropriate to knaves. That's a normative point, but I think it might be true. Okay. So then we get to the issues about what kinds of data does the government collect, not just why. I think it's helpful to ask the why question in the first place. Notice that with respect to the analogy from the supply and demand model for individual markets and the supply and demand model for the macroeconomy, demand curves are similar in each situation. That is, as the overall price level goes higher, supposing that your income has remained the same, or supposing that your income goes up, actually, as the overall price level goes up, you'll buy, well, no, all right. This presumes your income remains constant, and as the price level goes up, you buy less stuff. So the aggregate demand curve is analogous to the demand curve in the supply and demand model. It's a reflection of your demand to buy stuff, which stuff, all stuff, that is responding to the overall or average price level. It's only the supply curve that's kind of funny in the analogy. Okay. In our study of the macroeconomy, a classical model of the macroeconomy would not include the aggregate supply curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve. We would only have the long-run aggregate supply curve. And the reason for that is that there was a presumption that markets would clear quickly, that prices would adjust quickly. But when prices do not adjust quickly, that's when we end up with a somewhat more elastic short-run aggregate supply curve. If prices immediately adjusted, then any shift in aggregate demand would immediately be reflected in the full change in prices. We would just move to another point on that axis, but the total level of output wouldn't change at all. So if the price of everything doubled overnight, and your income along with it doubled overnight, you wouldn't be buying any more or less of anything, because relative prices would remain the same. That's the quantity theory of money. Keynes introduced the concept of sticky prices. The idea that in the short run, it's hard to renegotiate your wage. In the short run, it's hard to change the prices of things that are on menus. How many of you have seen a printed menu that the prices haven't changed very much in the last year, or at all? A lot of restaurants don't change their menus very often. And if you went to the restaurant that you're used to going to and the prices are usually a certain price, you go in and the prices are all 20% higher, you'd be like, wow, they raised their prices. I'm gonna go to a different restaurant. And until you try all the other restaurants and find out that they also raised their prices, right, you don't know how to make that adjustment. So menu pricing is another part of this.